but often actually was used topically as well. And so this is where I really feel that it shines. So it's a pain reliever and a really powerful wound healer.
Hello and welcome to the Herbs with Rosalee podcast, a show exploring how herbs heal as medicine, as food, and through nature connection. I'm your host, Rosalee de la Forêt. I created this YouTube channel to share trusted herbal wisdom so that you can get the best results when relying on herbs for your health. I love offering up practical knowledge to help you dive deeper into the world of medicinal plants and seasonal living. Each episode of the Herbs with Rosalee podcast is shared on YouTube as well as your favorite podcast app. Transcripts and recipes for each episode can be found at herbswithrosaleepodcast.com or through the link in the video description. Also in the video description, you'll find other helpful resources. For example, to get my best herbal tips, as well as fun bonuses, be sure to sign up for my weekly herbal newsletter. Okay, grab your cup of tea and let's dive in. First up is the Herbs with Rosalee Student Spotlight. Each week we celebrate a student whose journey brings inspiration to our herbal community. This week we're thrilled to spotlight Farah Ali from Ontario, Canada. Farah joined the Herbal Energetics course last year and is currently on the certificate path, where her thoughtful reflections and deep engagement have truly stood out. Farah's module reviews are full of insight and heart. She brings the lessons to life by sharing personal stories, often including her kids and her herbal adventures. She's also embraced food as medicine, exploring her spice rack with fresh curiosity. Here's what she shared in her own words. I've also loved how much the material can be applied to everyday life, like cooking with ingredients in our regular daily meals and using common kitchen herbs for healing or supporting our health. Before this course, I sort of saw herbalism as this separate entity that involved finding exotic ingredients or rare plants. It feels empowering now to realize I can use plants in such a practical, holistic way. My old thinking seems so limited in comparison. Farah's journey is a beautiful example of how herbal energetics can be woven into real life with depth, joy, and creativity. To celebrate Farah's contributions, Harmonic Arts is gifting her a $50 gift certificate to explore their exceptional herbal products. From functional mushrooms and tinctures to herbal lattes and artisan teas, Harmonic Arts crafts high-quality products with care. As a certified B Corp, they're dedicated to making a positive impact and continuously strive to nurture the connection between people and planet. Thank you, Harmonic Arts, for supporting our community and for your thoughtful offerings. If you'd like to explore Harmonic Arts offerings and support this show, you can find the link in the show notes. When checking out, use the coupon code Rosalee, that's ROSALEE, to get a 15% discount on your order. Hey friends, it's Rosalee. If you've been nourished by this podcast, if it's helped you feel more connected to the plants or more grounded in your own herbal path, then I'd love to invite you to join the Herbs with Rosalee podcast circle. This special membership helps make the podcast possible. It supports everything we do behind the scenes, and it gives you a chance to go even deeper with the content that you love. Inside the circle, you'll get exclusive herbal resources, live classes each season with some of my favorite herbal teachers, and a private space to connect with fellow plant lovers. It's where the heart of our herbal community continues to grow. To learn more and join us, visit herbalpodcastcircle.com. Your support means the world, and it helps this podcast continue to bloom. I'm so happy to share this conversation with Tiffany Harper. She's a deeply grounded herbalist whose work is rooted in land connection, community care, and a deep respect for the healing journey. In this episode, we talk about her path to becoming an herbalist, the powerful medicine of red osier dogwood, and the often overlooked importance of postpartum care. Tiffany brings so much heart and wisdom to everything she shares. I know you're going to love this one. Some of you may already be familiar with Tiffany, as she's a guest teacher in our Herbal Energetics course, where she offers a beautiful introduction to traditional Chinese medicine and the 5 elements. For those of you who don't already know her, Tiffany J. Harper, formerly Freeman, is a member of the Peguis First Nation Treaty 1. She is Muskogeauk, Anishinaabe, and German by ancestry, living in the Treaty 7 territory in Canada. Professionally, Tiffany is a registered clinical herbalist with the American Herbalist Guild, a doctor of acupuncture and traditional Chinese medicine, and a full-spectrum birth worker. Along with her clinical practice, she's an author and educator teaching a variety of courses in the field of herbalism and maintains a creative practice in the traditional arts, including beadwork and collaborations in the realm of public art. Tiffany, I'm thrilled to have you. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much, Rosalee.
Well, I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. I'm really excited about the plant that you've chosen as well. And first, I would love to dive in and hear your story and what has led you down the plant path.
Oh, well, I guess I'd say my plant path began in the summer times when I would spend with my grandparents. They lived in Manitoba, and we were often living out of the province. And so I would go back for the summer to visit with them, usually for a month or sometimes more. My mother, she was adopted by a Mennonite family, and her adopted mother, whom I call my Oma, she lived kind of one of those lives where everything was made from scratch. Everything came from the garden, or it was acquired from the connections within her community. So I remember with her, we would go on these long walks together, and we'd be picking different plants for different things. Particularly, she really liked to pick rose hips, which grew in abundance from around where she was living. And we would go and we'd make tea with that. And there was always some traditional remedy she always had for everything that ailed us as kids. So Manitoba, which if anybody's visited, is full of mosquitoes and black flies and bugs. So one of the things that I got to know, or one of the plants I got to know very well, was plantain. So she would make us a plantain preparation. So we spent lots of time with her as a child, and actually one of her children was studied to be a clinical herbalist as well, very early in the 80s. And so he had a very strong influence on our days as well. So he was giving us like teas or green mixtures, things to kind of support our days. And I always say that he's kind of the reason why I survived the 80s with all those processed foods and, different things like microwave dishes and stuff. I had all these herbs, and I had these green supplements that he had created as a professional herbalist. So I guess I grew up mostly within the plant medicine traditions from a European perspective. But my dad's family, on the other hand, they're Swampy Cree and also Anishinaabe, or they're from the St. Peter's Reserve, which is in Manitoba, just north of Winnipeg. And so even though we had this long history of, I would say, like traditions within the land, my dad would hunt, he would harvest things like moose or fish or different animals that we would eat. The plant knowledge, I would say, was mostly lost within our family. Of course, also with other things like language and many different traditions that would have came with our culture. So you have to understand that, like, my indigenous side of the family were a part of the creation, like the first colonization of Canada through the creation of Canada as a country, but through the Hudson's Bay Company. So they had very early contact with European people coming over here. And so there was a loss of a lot of that language and cultural traditions and teachings being passed on. And it really wouldn't be until I was in my 20s when I started working with an elder in my own traditional cultural traditions, including plant medicines. But before that, in my teens, in the 90s, I was getting into kind of like punk rock and, the against the norms type of thing, protesting, educating myself in activism. I became a vegetarian, which I'm not anymore because I eat more of a traditional diet. But it really inspired me to dive into sort of health and alternatives to kind of the standard American diet and traditional or systematic ways of seeing things. So I read lots of pivotal books, of course, and this inspired me to go on to study in herbal studies. So at the age of 20, I moved to Calgary, Alberta to study at the Wild Rose College of Natural Healing, and I studied with Dr. Terry Willard. And so I studied in person to become a clinical herbalist. From there, he inspired me actually to be a traditional Chinese medicine doctor, and with other teachers as well that were inspiring. And that was it. It's like 21 years of teaching herbalism and traditional Chinese medicine, and 18 years of clinical practice later. So this family connection, I think, is really what brought it through for me.
Oh, that's beautiful. Your story about the 90s, I resonate with a lot of that because I feel like I had a kind of a parallel situation. For me, it wasn't punk rock so much as like Tori Amos, but definitely, um,
Yeah.
I felt like there was like kind of opening of the eyes and seeing the world through a different light. And that I'm curious, you said that you read some pivotal books. Do you remember some titles there of some books that influenced you?
Yeah, I remember it was a Diet for a Small Planet. This
Mm,
opening my ideas into like food and kind of environmental activism as being like a really pivotal book, especially for becoming a vegetarian, right?
hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I was also a vegetarian and vegan for a while, but ultimately didn't work out for me. So, uh, but that had the same kind of like I assume might be some of the same motivations of just wanting to live on this earth in a good way. And
Yeah.
yeah, and so I was also just kind of curious, like, what does herbalism look like in Canada? Like, you went to Wild Rose, which I'm familiar with, and Terry Willard. It was interesting to me that. Um, that someone had become a clinical herbalist in the early 80s. Were there schools in
Mhm.
Canada in the early 80s for herbalism?
There was, and I guess it wouldn't be considered a clinical herbalist. I think they were called maybe, I, I think they were just herbalists. I don't know
Yeah.
exactly what the term that they were using for it, but he was working in a clinical environment. He had clinical training.
Mhm.
There was one of the earlier schools was the Dominion Herbal College,
Oh,
and
of course, right.
yeah, and so that was a school that my uncle attended, and then Wild Rose actually, there's this year, this summer is their 50th year anniversary.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow,
so
that's really cool. Yeah,
so yeah,
wonderful.
there's a long tradition of it in Canada for sure, of herbal
Yeah.
studies.
And
Mhm.
then what did your TCM training look like? That was like so I'm assuming you went to Wild Rose and then you went to a whole other school, or does Wild Rose have TCM training as well? Or
Yeah, so as a part of the Wild Rose curriculum, they had a year long introduction to traditional Chinese medicine. So it was a traditional Chinese medicine like foundations program, and then we did a foundations in the herbal aspect. It was called Traditional Chinese Materia Medica. And
Mhm.
so that was my first introduction to that. That really inspired me as well as working with Terry Willard. I also had another Chinese medicine practitioner that I did my practicum with and was really inspired after seeing acupuncture in action. And
Mhm.
so that also sent me on my way to Chinese medicine school.
Mhm.
I had, thought about going other places to study Chinese medicine, but it worked out at the time that I just stay locally. And we actually have three Chinese medicine schools in Calgary,
Wow.
which is kind of amazing that
Mhm.
it can sustain three schools. So I went to one of the schools here in Calgary, and it's 4 years and a lot of clinical practice. And I had a nice lead on it by having had learned a little bit already about the foundations of it.
Mhm.
And so I really got to focus more on the diagnosis, assessment, learning a new language, of course, which is
Mhm.
not English and not even anywhere close to it. So
Mhm.
yeah,
And what do your days look like now, Tiffany? Like, how are you mainly a clinician? Do you teach? Just how does your herbal life play out these days?
yeah. So mostly I do two things. I'm a clinician. I have a private clinical practice where I see patients 3 days a week now. This is because it's busy in the other aspects. I'm also teaching, and so I teach for a variety of different schools, Wild Rose being one of them. And then I do some online teaching for other schools as well, just across North America.
Including me a
And,
little
and yes, that's
too.
right. It was a lovely time, I have to say.
Mhm.
So that it's got a really nice flow to it, I have to say. I think in the early
Mm,
days, I really spent a lot of time in the clinic, seeing people back to back. And now I'm taking a bit more time to explore other things as well. And so my herbal life is a little less in the garden as I would like it to be sometimes, and
mhm,
more just in the clinic working with people and then connecting them to the plants. I have an apothecary in my practice as well, which so I can make my own formulas, and I also bring in some other stuff from other people too. So
mhm. Lovely. Well, I'm really excited that you chose red osier dogwood. I think this is going to be a plant that's new to a lot of people, but I actually meant to look this up beforehand and I didn't. But I want to say that this is a very common shrub in North America. And so even if it's new to people, I think that folks will be
really fascinated to learn about it. And then, it's how, like, I always feel like when I learn a new plant, suddenly it's everywhere. And this is a plant that actually can jump out of the landscape at certain times of year. And
Mhm.
yeah, and it's just very, very common, at least here in the whole Pacific and inland Northwest. So I can speak for that for sure. So I
Yeah.
guess my first question to you would be, why did you choose red osier dogwood?
Um, it's one of the plants that I find that I have a very strong affinity to, and
Mm,
I think the number one reason for that is that there's a big cultural significance for us as First Nations here all across the plains. You're right; it is everywhere, and people have most likely seen it. It pops up everywhere in Canada except for the territory of Nunavut, which
mm,
is like far, far north. And I believe that it grows in pretty much every state as well, maybe aside from Hawaii. So it's
mm,
that plant that is everywhere. And in the summertime, it might just blend in with the foliage, but in the wintertime, like you said, it's like this stark contrast to the landscape, especially where it's snowy, right? Because it's bright
mhm,
red and sticks out of the
mhm.
ground and looks like fire coming out of the earth almost in the snowiness.
Yeah, it is very
Mhm.
striking. We have snow here and we have a lot of red osier by our pond. And so, yeah, that's one of my favorite looks actually, is just that the bright red bark coming out of the snow like that. It's beautiful.
Yeah, I agree. That's very beautiful. Hmm.
Well, this isn't a plant that I've worked with very much, so I'm excited to hear more about it in that regard as well.
Thanks. No, so yeah, I guess I'll start talking a little bit about it then. I am very excited to be sharing it as well. And so here in Canada, we use the Cornus stolonifera. Stolonifera. My Latin is the pits sometimes. So sometimes we also talk about sericea as well, but here we're using that stolonifera. Swampy Cree, we call it Miqua pimakwa. And the Miqua or Mikosu, which is the root word for it, actually just means red. And in Cree language, it's like when we talk about plants, we talk about things in an animate perspective because the plants are living. So this is the red in reference. Mikosu is something that's alive and red. Um, Miqua pimakwa means literally red willow scrapings. So the scraping is referring to a part of the plant that we often use the most. And this is that we call it a stringy cambium. So it's like the inner bark of the plant, which is greenish. And this is the part that a lot of Indigenous First Nations communities within Canada we use as a part of our ceremonies, but also for part of our medicines. So other names are things like red bush. We call it red willow quite often, which is really confusing, I think, sometimes,
Mhm.
because it actually isn't even a willow at all. And I think quite often in the States, I've heard it referred to as American dogwood.
I've definitely heard the red willow, and that did throw me like early on. Like it was just kind of confusing. I think that when I first learned that it wasn't willow, I like wasn't ready to believe it because it's
That's
been
right.
referred to like red willow for so long. So yeah, that is a
Yeah.
little confusing. Yeah.
It is, and it has some similar characteristics to willow. Like it really likes to grow in like coulees, damp ravines, which is like a salix family or willow family kind of characteristic. It also grows really tall too, like 5 to 6 feet tall. And the other thing that makes it very similar is that it also bends really easily. So even as it's fresh, it bends. Sometimes we would steam it also to bend to make things like dream catchers, for example, was one of the traditional uses that it would have been used for. Mhm. So I guess in terms of the identification of it, as I mentioned, it's a little harder to identify in the summer because of when it's in its just leaf form. It has these really beautiful, like kind of medium green leaves that are like rounded at the base and then more pointed at the tip, and they have little short hairs on the bottom of the leaf. Still has like a reddish bark on the stems. As I mentioned, it's like 5 to 6 feet tall in some cases, and usually grows where it's damp. As I mentioned, it's so beautiful in contrast to the garden because of that redness. Um, and here in the northern climates, up here in Canada, I'm not that far north in Canada, just Calgary, which is not that far, like 3 hours from the border of Montana. So, southern in relation to the actual northern parts of Canada. In June, usually it starts to flower, and the flowers are also really amazing. Like they're these little greenish, little tiny white flowers that grow in clusters together, which makes that very characteristic look. And then those eventually start to change as the season moves into summer into these beautiful white berries. And those white berries are kind of waxy and kind of creamy, and they will last all through the winter. So they are often food for a lot of the birds that are sticking around in the northern cold temperatures. One thing to mention about this plant before we get into the uses of it is that there is a note that many of the parts of this particular red osier dogwood can be toxic if consumed in larger amounts, especially if they're taken internally. So just for this conversation purposes, I'm going to talk about it mostly as an external medicine. Okay. But good. First, I want to talk about a little of the traditions first. So we'll talk a little bit about how it was traditionally used. Cool. So the Cree, as I mentioned, which is where my family's culture is, we would use the stem bark as a tea that we'd be drinking internally, like an infusion, to help with upper respiratory tract infections, chest troubles, things like coughs. When it was cold, so the tea was allowed to cool down, it acquires more of a diuretic type of property to it. So we'd say that it would be used more for dysuria, so like troubles going pee or inability to pee. The other thing we'd use is the white berries, and externally they were used like kind of cooked and mashed up and used as like a poultice for the eyes. And some would say that it would be good for cataracts, but the common use was for snow blindness, which I imagine that many people down south haven't even heard of snow blindness before. But people who are living outside, northerners who are traveling by dog sled and such, staring or having this excessive exposure to UV or ultraviolet rays would create an issue within the eyes, and so it create a sensitivity and also can damage the eyes. So the white berries were actually used as a poultice to help mitigate that. And then it was a food source. And if you've ever tasted them, the berries themselves are actually, in my opinion, not that tasty.
I thought you were going to say not that bad. But no.
They're not that tasty. There's so many. We're spoiled, right? Because we have all of these amazing different berries, and especially within Canada, we have so many different berries. So even the traditions of the Cree, they would mix them. They would mix them with Saskatoon berries to give it what they would call sweet and sours. So the dogwood berries would be more on the sour, and the Saskatoon would be more of like a sweet type of treat. Right? Actually, the Blackfoot, where I'm living here in Blackfoot territory, they also had a sweet and sours recipe of the Saskatoon and the dogwood berries, but they would use that specifically for ceremonies for elders and for the male elders within their community. So I'm so curious about more of that and hearing the stories about it. As I mentioned too, this bush is very flexible. So as I mentioned, people would get dream catchers with them. One of the elders whom has passed away, who worked with my friend and colleague Robert Rogers, Russell Willier, he talked about the use of making dogwood into pipe stems to make ceremonial pipes. And he has a description in the book that he did with Robert Rogers about sticking in the stem of the red osier dogwood into a goldenrod gull. So a gull that grows on goldenrod. And so the stem would go inside, and the gull, the little, whatever it is, like a little larva, would crawl through the stem of the dogwood. And so it would actually hollow it out for you.
Interesting.
I've never tried this in practice, but
wow, well, that's fascinating.
Yeah, it's kind of a neat way of using what you have and then just nature created.
It's kind
Uh,
of brilliant, really.
it is kind of brilliant.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, there are so many other brilliant uses, like using it as a dye, like that red.
Mhm.
When you work with it, like when we're scraping it back, because we often use, as I mentioned, that inner bark that's green, you're scraping off the red. Depending on the time of years, your hands get all red.
Hmm.
And so this was actually used as like a dye quite often. So you
Oh,
could
cool.
mix in fabrics and kind of dye materials with it. Fish traps as well, because it's flexible. Basketry was also a thing. So I think even Robert Rogers mentions using it, that it can be used as like the berries, for example, can be used as a hair conditioner,
Oh,
which I
interesting.
haven't tried either, but
I want to try that.
I like this idea.
Yeah.
But many of the indigenous cultures here in Canada around us in the plains areas, like the Cree, the Anishinaabe, the Blackfoot, the Stoney, the Sutena, a lot of the people here use the inner green bark for similar reasons. And sometimes what's also used was the leaves as well from the plant or from the bush. And the primary use was as a smoking mixture. And so it got put into smoking mixes that were used for maybe pipe ceremonies, put into ceremonial bundles, and was also created as like an offering tobacco. So it's such a beautiful process. One that, this is why I love sharing it, is when you spend time with the plant. We say that we would harvest after the first thunder, if we were using this for a ceremonial perspective. So early spring, when you get the first thunder, it's permission that you are to go and pick your medicines. And we go and we harvest, and we do a process of offerings, and but scraping it down. Now I use like a fruit peeler or a vegetable peeler, because it's easy. And you don't lose as much as if you're just using a knife. Depends on your knife skills, I guess. I imagine there's people out there that probably have pretty good knife skills. But so I use a vegetable peeler, and peeling it off, and there's this connection that you have with it, knowing that this is just such a very sacred medicine. And through the purpose of using it as this tobacco. Now, again, because it has some toxicity to it, it can have a narcotic effect as well, some people say. So it's, again, to be used with other plants quite often, never on its own, and in moderation. Traditionally, though, I think that my favorite use is as a postpartum care medicine. So in some traditions, the dogwood decoction was given after childbirth, and so that'd be like cooked in water and then drank as a like a broth of the plant bark. But often actually was used topically as well, and so this is where I really feel that it shines. So it's a pain reliever and a really powerful wound healer, and I believe that this is primarily due to its contents of cornic acid. So cornic acid is very similar to acetylsalicylic acid, or ASA, but not as strong. So it can be used definitely as pain relief. So, of course, this idea of using it in the postpartum time, we would use it, as we'll talk about in a bit, the recipe of using it as a sitz bath or a peri-soak to help with pain relief and healing. One thing that I want to just mention too is that when I make postpartum packages for people who've had babies, I will often include this red Osier Dogwood as a tobacco offering. So I will make my own tobacco out of it, which is tobacco, meaning that it's just an offering that would be given to the earth as a part of a package along with the soak, specifically for a reason. And this is why I feel like there's this really strong connection with this red Osier Dogwood in childbirthing. It's often given as, okay, we say like an offering tobacco for the burial of the placenta. So the placenta in my culture is considered to be an ancestor. And the reason that is that its sole role is to nourish and to care for an unborn child, right? So its name, Aspisque si mun, that's what it is, Aspisque si mun, excuse me. That refers to a pillow. So using this as a medicine, as an offering tobacco, specifically after birth and for the burial of the placenta. As I mentioned, this placenta, in my culture, this aspisque simon is a baby's pillow. It actually directly translates to pillow. So when the placenta is delivered after the child's birth, we say that that placenta or that ancestor actually dies. So we bury the ancestor by a tree, and an offering is given. There are some medicines that are traditionally used to bury the placenta, and one of them is the red Osier Dogwood that is given as a tobacco mixture, and this is a sort of a typical offering. We have a different way of thinking about child birth and child rearing, I think, than, of course, than the Western norm way. And the term awasis in Cree is the term for child. And the awasis actually directly translates to the term of being lent a spiritual being.
Wow.
So, yeah. So with this, it's a really big deal when you are being lent a spiritual being. So they are now under your care. This apisque simon is now being put down to the earth. This ancestor is being put down to the earth, and they were one of the care providers. And so this is now this ceremony to change our role. And so the red Osier Dogwood is that medicine that we're giving to give gratitude and thanks for the care that this ancestor has provided, but also signifies this change in relationship that we have, that we are now recognizing this new phase of being a steward of a child, that the ancestor once had been having the sole, role of nourishment. So along with this Peri-Soak, I always give a little bit of an offering. So, and if people are interested in walking through that process, then definitely that's a part of the things that I would communicate with them about. But also just giving it as an offering, and the intention behind it doesn't have to be also with a burial of the placenta. Of course, keeping it culturally relevant for them. But it's just a nice offering and a gift to say, I'm grateful for this transition that you're going to embark upon.
Yeah. It's beautiful, Tiffany.
Thanks.
Let's talk about this recipe, the Peri-Soak.
So a Peri-Soak. What the heck's a Peri-Soak, right? So you if you look back, there was many different sort of traditions, like we call them like the housemakers remedies that would be considered. They would consider things like a sitz bath, like sitting in a tea or sitting in an infusion of herbs. So essentially, a sitz bath is a Peri-Soak. It is a herbal preparation that's infused, steeped in water, and can be soaked wherever. And in this case, in the perineum area, so the area on the undercarriage on the bottom. You can use it in a couple of different ways. You can put it in a tub. Sometimes there's even these specific vessels that are you can buy that sit on top of a toilet seat that you can kind of submerge your bottom in. But quite often I like to use it because of simplicity's sake and also for time's sake. You have a new baby, lounging in a peri, soak might not be the time frame that you have at the moment. So a peri bottle is also something that quite a lot of midwives and doulas are sharing with their clients. So a peri bottle is like essentially a plastic bottle that can be used as a spray, and you can spray on the perineum and that whole undercarriage. It's kind of like a portable bidet, right? So we use the infusion of this plant in that peri bottle or in the soak. Some people even will soak them into like material or pads. If you get like those cotton pads, you can put it, easily in a pair of underwear. It's a little messy, but they can sit for a little bit of time in there. So as I mentioned, these packages that I'm sending home to my postpartum clients, one of them is this Peri-Soak, and it varies in recipe, but quite often it has a lot of the same elements. Red Osier Dogwood is one of the first ones that I usually will include in it. And so the recipe, I usually put about 5 grams in there. This is for that pain relieving and wound healing type of effect. Again, I always think of it as a kind of a spiritual medicine as well. So it's like an offering to that area, a gratitude for the changes that are happening. Calendula, because it's just a powerful wound healer, soothing, of course, to the tissues. Rose flowers, I really like. There's just something beautiful about it. You see roses in a formula, and it adds color. It has a beautiful smell. It has a softness to it that when it is on your skin, it feels comforting. So it's got astringent qualities to it. It's calming in nature. It helps kind of clear some of that heat out of the tissues. And then I like to also add yarrow as well. And so yarrow is one of those plants that is used quite often for either promoting bleeding or stopping bleeding. It's a very powerful wound healer. And so it feels really nice to put on your tissues after they've been through a lot, right? So to make it, I'll usually infuse all the herbs in usually about a cup of boiling water. I usually put a lid on it just to protect the aromatic properties of the plants that are in there. You can let it cool, of course, till it's like more of a room temperature. You don't want it to be cold. We talk about in Chinese medicine that cold on the under part of the body, any cold actually, no matter where it is, can help or create constriction or contraction in the tissues. And when you have constriction and contraction, then you can get more pain. We also say that it can actually create more bleeding. So I wouldn't do like a frozen pad type of situation with this medicine. I would use it in like a warm temperature instead. So you would steep it and then strain out all of the herbal, all the like loose herbs, compost them, and then you could use it as like in a peri-wash or soak it in a little tub. If you are going to use a tub, you probably will have to add a bit more warm water to it, and it will be a little bit more diluted. So I really, really like it more as a peri-wash. Double check the temperature too, okay? Because things that feel okay on your hands and in your under parts of your area, your bum, your bottom, all of that's going to feel a lot hotter, and we don't want to create any more stress in that area. Also to make sure, everything's clean too. So make sure your jars are clean, make sure what you're using, your hands are clean, especially if you've had like surgery as well. So you want to be kind of mindful to avoid surgical areas. If you've had a birth by cesarean, your tissues have still gone through transitions, especially if you've been laboring through and then you were in a surgical type of scenario. It's still really helpful for that area to have those healing herbs and properties to help with the kind of tissues going back into more of a normal place again. So making sure that everything's clean, making sure you're avoiding any surgical areas, and then storing it. Like if you don't use it all, you can store it in the fridge. I recommend, of course, we take it out to warm it up a little bit again. The dried herbs itself can last quite a long time, like 1 to 2 years, in a cool, dark storage. But the infusion, once you've made it, definitely use it within 24 hours, even if it's in the fridge, okay? Just because it's also in a really sensitive area, we want to make sure that we're not introducing any unwanted bacteria.
This is such a beautiful blend, Tiffany. It's like beautiful in a couple senses. Like one, just the medicinal formulation of it is really nice. And then the beauty of it as well. Like you mentioned, it got me thinking about it because you mentioned the beauty of the rose petals. Then we have like the orange or yellow of the calendula, and then the white flowers of the yarrow, and then the bark of the red osier. So all of it just sounds really lovely and beautiful. And which I just think I like beautiful things myself, but also just, for new parents and, just going through and having tender tissues and it just seems like a really it's beauty on another level too of just self-care and tending. And so it's lovely.
Yeah, thank you.
I had to just kind of a random practical question because I don't see red osier sold really, and I'm curious, like, do you harvest what you send out with your patients, or is it something that you can buy in Canada, or just how do you procure it?
I decided, so I live very close to the river. And so for quite a while, I was going out and through ceremony harvesting, but that was more for just like offerings. When I wanted to start using it like on the body, I wanted to make sure that where I was getting it, dogs weren't peeing and other things like that. So I started growing my own. And
Hmm.
it happens to be one of the things that's very easy to find in a garden center because it's so beautiful and it's quite a popular bush for people to have in their yards.
Mm-hmm.
So I've started to just grow my own and then harvest out of my yard.
Oh, that's really great. Oh, what a
Yeah,
wonderful service. Just that care that goes into the harvest that then gets into these care packages, and that's beautiful.
thank
Yeah.
you.
Do
Yeah.
you do a lot of growing and harvesting of the plants that you use in practice?
I wish I did more, but
Mm.
because I do work quite a bit in the clinic, I don't have a lot
Yeah.
of time to do it. So I
Yeah.
am supporting other farmers and growers, especially for the
Nice.
volume of plants that I have to go through within a clinical perspective.
That's exactly why I asked, because I was kind of feeling like there's just no way, right? So,
No,
yeah,
no.
yeah.
Yeah, I do have a yard that I don't grow vegetables in my yard because I have friends that do biodynamic gardening and or vegetable growing, and their vegetables are the best. So I spend all my time tending to my perennials, and a lot of them are medicines like the dogwood, for example, the red
Mhm.
Osier dogwood, and others. And I do like small batch preparations of
Mhm.
things like monarda or
Mhm.
motherwort, various different plants that I have in the garden, but it's not enough for like a commercial or clinical type of use.
Yeah, yeah, that's fair.
Mhm.
That does tell us a lot, just how, like, as you began speaking about this plant, just how special it is to you that this is one of the few chosen ones that you choose to grow and work with and harvest and prepare. So,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
Mhm. Thank
Well,
you.
thank you for sharing so much about the recipe. And for listeners, you can download your copy of the recipe at the herbswithrosalee.podcast.com page or just visit the show notes. We'll get that to you. You've shared so much about red osier already. Is there anything else you'd like to share before we move on?
I think that it's such a beautiful plant, and for the Cree traditions, as I mentioned, we think of these plants as being living beings, and so developing a relationship. And I feel like I really encourage people to go out and to grow things, to get to know them in a way.
Mhm.
And one of the ways that we're taught how to do that culturally is to introduce yourself to it when you're working with it. In the way that, say, you would meeting a new neighbor, you would say like, "Hi, Rosalee, my name is Tiffany. I live next door." We say that it's the same idea with plants because they're animate, they're alive. That we go out, and when we're going to start to work with them and develop a relationship, that we have to start out with that introduction of it, of ourselves and
Mm,
our intentions behind it. So um, I recommend that. Yeah, just starting to develop a kind of a personal relationship, even if you don't hear communication directly back, because sometimes we don't hear all those things, the subtleties of the ways that plants speak. It's still this respect that we're showing to the plant to honor a relationship that we're developing.
that's beautiful. Thanks for sharing that. Obviously, translatable to all the plants that we fall in love with. And
Absolutely.
I would like to encourage folks to get to know red osier because, like we said, it grows in so many different places. It's such a fun plant to know. And once you see it, you'll see red osier everywhere, and it is so beautiful. So, yeah, what a
Yeah,
great one to go introduce ourselves to.
I agree.
Well, Tiffany, I'd love to transition to hear what kind of herbal projects you have going on in your life right now.
Well, it's interesting. Herbal projects. Some of the work that I've been doing recently, actually speaking a little bit about what I just mentioned, this introduction to plants. My partner and I, who's a visual artist, he and I have been creating a lot of kind of public art related projects in relation to plants. So we just did one where we are getting people to explore their neighborhood in a way to get to know their plant neighbors. And so we
Oh, cool.
created this connection between red Osier Dogwood as being one of the plants that lives in their neighborhood, or things like Monarda or wolf willow, all of the different native species like wild roses. And what we've done is actually created a website where people can go to learn a little bit about them. But it's not in the way that as herbalists we would talk about plants, like the constituents. It's not like a monograph. It's more as if you are meeting them on a personal level. And the reason why we wanted to create this was that a lot of people, when you consult with them or you talk with them, they speak about a feeling or a sense of a disconnection from the natural environment, especially when they're within an urban center. And in this way, it kind of takes a different view on that urbanity, where you start to actually focus on the nature that is present at your doorstep, that's present on the sidewalks, that's present in the gardens of other people or near the rivers or pathways, and is like a sense of connection, like a community feeling that you get when you start to realize and recognize, hey, actually, I am surrounded by nature. And in that, part of this has been my activism mission, is to help people kind of go back to the realization that humans are also a part of nature. Like, we are nature. And through that, we develop a sense of stewardship in that process. And even in an urban center, like, we often think of, stewardship as only being something that's relevant to, herb growers or, farmers or, gardeners outside of the city. But this is also very relevant to where we are, taking care of the native species and plants, and, for many different reasons. And one of that is that connection, but also, for, as we're in a world with changing climate, where we know that native, perennial species of plants can be very helpful to that environment. So that's it's called Rooted in Community, and that's one of the projects that we've been focusing on quite a bit.
Oh, I love this. This is also a passion of mine, so I'm very interested. Is that the website then, rootedincommunity.com or
.ca? Yeah.
.ca?
rootedincommunity.ca.
rootedincommunity.ca. Great. We will
Yeah.
definitely put that in the show notes too. I'm excited to go check that out. That sounds absolutely lovely. Yeah, absolutely a passion of mine, that whole restitching ourselves back into understanding we're a part of nature, and the stewardship that comes along with it, no matter what the climate we live in, whether that is inner city or in the country. All of that, right up my alley. I love that.
Great. Yeah.
And I believe that you're also doing more work with postpartum patients, and that. I'd love to hear more about that too.
Yeah, so this is another area. For many years, I've been teaching professionally. So whether it's herbalism or Chinese medicine, and over the course of my clinical practice, I'd have to say it like naturally evolved into being geared towards like reproductive, generative, pregnancy-related health. The further down that road and working with people, I started to really realize or become very acutely aware of the importance of that postpartum transition, that there was not as much support within our medical system, within even outside of, in Canada, what we call the private health system, which would be herbalists and naturopaths and others of the, other than the medical professionals category. Even in those areas, you weren't seeing a lot of attention to postpartum care and health. And so a lot of my focus in my clinical practice has moved towards that. But also I began to see the value in offering classes as well. So I did a training through, it's called Birthing Advocacy in the United States. And I did a full spectrum doula course and also a childbirth educator program. And so I've been offering that to, non-students of herbalism, just to, people or parents or caregivers that are wanting to learn a little bit more about childbirth, pregnancy, and particularly that postpartum time. So focusing on the traditions, focusing on food, focusing on supportive plants, and also, when relevant, supporting people with ceremony as well through that process.
Oh, that's lovely. Can people learn more about that through your website then, and just your offerings in that way?
Yeah, it's under the childbirth education.
Wonderful. Well, that link will also be in the show notes.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Well, before you go, I have one last question for you, Tiffany. And that question is, how do herbs instill hope in you?
Yes. Um, yeah, I believe that plants have always been like our kin. So they remind us of our connections, like our familial connections. And I always think about familial connections as being to like our connections as humans, as I mentioned, as a part of nature and also to the earth. Our relationships with plants and the plant world has always been intertwined and connected really from the time of the human creation. That you think of the support of food, of medicines, and also of shelter as well. Example I would say of like the traditional teachings of man min, which is the wild rice. Um, Wild rice it was a traditional food that was also a teacher, and it taught us to live well in the world. It taught us how to sustain each other, how to sustain ourselves with good food, and also how to be a steward of waterways, right? Because of where it grows in the water. So I feel like herbs instill hope in me through that recognition of those connections that we have. That it reminds us of our humanity, of our place that we have within as a part of nature, that we can see ourselves as like a part of that bigger picture, as a relative, right? Like a cousin, as a sibling. And as I mentioned before, it once we recognize that part or that role that we have and that stewardship dynamic, we start to see sort of our role and our responsibilities in that. So being a steward of the earth, taking care of the planet, but also taking care of each other. And so plants and the way that we work with plant medicines, to me, is really about how us humans are taking care of each other. Right? We study these herbal traditions, we work with our elders and our mentors, and we can share how we can take care of one another. And again, it's like this cycle of this continuum of care of the environment that we are continuing, right, through the learning of these traditions. So I believe that these plants teach us. They remind us, they remind us of our connection to the earth and again to one another.
That is just so beautiful. I love the weaving of all of that you've just been speaking about together of introducing ourselves to the plants, recognizing them as kin, and therefore also recognizing all their so much to learn from them as well. It's just really beautiful. Beautifully said, Tiffany. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rosalee.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's been such a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing so much wisdom with us, and for sharing this like special care for postpartum time too. I agree with you in that this is a time that needs more attention, and I just really appreciate that you brought more attention to that for us. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to bring that out and to discuss that with people and to hopefully inspire folks to learn a little bit more about Osier Dogwood.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks, Rosalee.
Thanks for being here. Don't forget to head over to the show notes at herbswithrosaleepodcast.com to download your beautifully illustrated recipe card. There, you'll also be able to sign up for my newsletter, which is the best way to stay in touch with me. You can find more about Tiffany at her website, otnikan wellness.ca, or check out the show notes. If you'd like more herbal episodes to come your way, then one of the best ways to support this podcast is by subscribing on YouTube or your favorite podcast app. I deeply believe that this world needs more herbalists and plant-centered folks, and I'm so glad that you're here as part of this herbal community. Also, a big round of thanks to the people all over the world who make this podcast happen week to week. Emily Thomas Anderson is the project manager who oversees the entire podcast operation, from guest outreach to writing show notes and on and on. I often tell people, I just show up. Emily does most of the heavy lifting. Nicole Paul is the operator for the entire Herbs with Rosalee school and community. She keeps an eagle eye view on everything to ensure it's running smoothly. Francesca is our fabulous video and audio editor. She not only makes listening more pleasant, she also adds beauty to the YouTube videos with plant images and video overlays.
Tatiana Rusakova is the botanical illustrator who creates gorgeous plant and recipe illustrations for us. I love them, and I know you love them. Once the illustration is ready, Jenny creates the recipe cards as well as the thumbnail images for YouTube. Alex is our behind-the-scenes tech support and social media manager, and Karen and Emily are our student services coordinators and community support. If you've written in with a question, undoubtedly you got help from them. For those of you who like to read along, Jennifer is who creates the transcripts each week. Xavier, my handsome French husband, is the cameraman and website IT guy. It takes an herbal village to make it all happen, including you. Thank you so much for your support through your comments, reviews, and ratings. One of my favorite things about this podcast is hearing from you. I read every comment that comes in, and I'm excited to hear your thoughts. Okay, you've lasted to the very end of the show, which means you get a round of applause, a gold star, and this herbal tidbit. Well, red osier dogwood isn't just a beautiful plant, it's also a powerhouse for supporting wildlife. Its white berries are an important food source for over 18 bird species, including ruffed grouse, wild turkeys, and gray catbirds. The shrub also provides food and shelter for mammals like deer and rabbits and chipmunks. And perhaps most delightfully, it's a host plant for over 100 species of butterflies and moths, including the spring azure and the crocus geometer moth. Thanks for joining me on this herbal adventure. I'll see you next time. Hi, it's Rosalee. If this podcast has brought you inspiration or grounded you in your love of herbs, I'd love to invite you to join the podcast circle. Your membership helps support the show, and it gives you access to live herbal classes, exclusive resources, and a warm community of fellow plant lovers. Learn more and join us at herbalpodcastcircle.com. Your support truly helps this podcast thrive. Thank you.